thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about my own experience of extremism, just because it has informed a lot of my thinking about how we address this problem and the work that we do at the Institute. And I'm very bad at this because I'm basically British, although with no English background, and we hate sharing personal stories, but I'm told that that's the only way to start any kind of presentation in America. So when in Rome. So here goes. I watch, my family is from former Yugoslavia. I say this because there wasn't a person in Yugoslavia that didn't have a connection to somebody across what are now state borders. And I watched as a teenager the implosion of a developed and integrated environment into genocidal fury, and was totally shocked and overwhelmed by this, but also had the privilege of not living it entirely, of going in and out. And so I had a strange perspective on the issue, because every 3 months I would go back in, I would engage with my friends and my family and see the shift that had happened. And what was extraordinary to me was to see how successful the manipulation of then state-controlled media in each of the former states of Yugoslavia had been in fundamentally transforming the perceptions of people in each of these places, of their attitudes towards each other. People who'd lived side by side, I mean literally neighbors, who'd known each other their whole lives, that I'd known my whole life, people who were the best of friends, suddenly fundamentally transformed. And I watched that in the UK, where I was growing up, and was also overwhelmed by the lack of care shown by anybody, it seemed to me, in the UK about this situation, about a genocide unfolding at the heart of Europe that nobody seemed to care about. And I was overwhelmed with anger. And if somebody had given me an option at that point in time to go and do something about this, to take up arms, to go and fight, I would have done it. If I had had perhaps more wherewithal, I might have found a way to do it. It was amazing to me, more than a decade later, talking to many British Muslims about what mobilized them and radicalized many of them. They were watching this situation and with horror, and many of them did find a way to go and fight. So I say this because I took away a few things from this. One, and I should say, in the aftermath of the war, I worked for a decade in conflict resolution in the area. What I also started to see was something strange happening on the ground, which was a set of investments being made after the war by primarily Gulf-based charities in communities. And they seemed pretty free of strings attached. Certainly in relation to the conditionality of Western engagement in the area. So the benevolent condescension of the European Union: if you do the following 500 things, you will get a school, it will be paid. And in contrast to that, we saw small, nimble Gulf charities set up shop. Don't do anything, it's okay. Handouts to families directly who were needy at the time. So change a little bit of this, a little bit of that. People took the money, really did it tongue-in-cheek, because they had absolutely no cultural affinity with these groups, or indeed with the ambitions that they had. And so my takeaways, that the impact of organized communications efforts, whether they are state-driven, as was the case in the lead-up to the war, or indeed driven from external actors coming in after the war, can be profound and long-lasting. We have in many different contexts, I think, seen this, but certainly in terms of the lead up to conflict, the ability of certain media to have an impact on attitudes and behavior is extraordinary. The second thing that I took away was that it is easy to mobilize idealistic young people. That is not hard. And the third thing really was that, I suppose, a question that it left in my mind around what it took, what was it in the minds of people that made them able to commit mass murder? Ordinary people, not psychopaths, not people with mental illness, ordinary people. And that question haunted me for some time, and I have spent really, in a sense, my career trying to figure that out and look at ways in which we prevent, essentially, conflict and genocide. So when people talk to me about CVE, I balk, because it is the narrowest possible lens on the problem that we are collectively here working on, which is conflict prevention. So I wanted to say a few things. Just one, a little bit about ideology. Two, a little bit about the internet, because all of what I've just said happened pre-internet. But the internet has come, of course, into the fore on these issues and is playing a role. Three, I wanted to just say a few words about learning from the best at this. And I'll talk a little bit about ISIS and Russia, because I think they're really, really good at this. And then about what we can really do and the need, in my mind, to get ahead of the curve, because I think one of the problems that I see is that we're constantly about 5 years behind the curve on what's actually happening with this problem, perhaps 10. And in many ways, I think some of the conversations here, having worked in this space now for quite some time, feel like Groundhog Day, and I hope we can move forward. So on ideology, there's been lots of semantic debate about ideology, and I have taken what is often an unpopular view and said I think ideology is absolutely critical. But I think it's critical in a slightly different way to many people who talk about ideology. The ideology that we're talking about is the ideology of extremism. And that is the following. Extremist mindset and thinking is the positing of the superiority of one in-group over whatever the out-group is, and the positing that that in-group must dominate over all others, whether by the subjugation of that out-group to its norms and its rules, or by its elimination. That is extremist ideology. It has happened throughout time, within different contexts, within different groups. The othering of people, the dehumanization of out-groups, is the precursor to mass murder. It is, in fact, the only thing that enables mentally well individuals to turn into killers en masse. And it is that component of the ideology of extremism that we must be awake to, alive to, and constantly fighting. Ideology matters. And what I believe we're seeing today is the result of the rise of mainstreaming extremism, cumulative mainstreaming extremism, which is to say that different variants of this ideology are on the rise and are playing a symbiotic, reinforcing role with each other. And I don't mean this in an abstract way. This is happening in a very real, tactical way. So we see Islamist groups and far-right groups wonderfully mobilizing each other's fan bases. They know that they speak to each other's fan bases very well and that they mobilize them. We see now the mirroring of narrative and tactics. The far-right using terminology like white jihad and showing its supporters training manuals and propaganda from ISIS. They are aware of each other and they are mobilizing successfully with a view to making a play for the center of gravity of their communities, whatever they may be, and making their objectives, which are political in nature, mainstream. And that political objective is shared across these extremist constituencies. Make no mistake, I think we tend to talk about Islamist objectives in very different terms. I was challenged on this the other day. But the growing, and it is really sizable, and we should be very worried, but the growing extreme right movement, which has connected the dots across quite a wide spectrum ideologically, and has mobilized very strategically now. We've done deep dive research now and have put out a report just recently on what we've called the Fringe Insurgency. They are extremely potent and dangerous, and we underestimate them. And they are playing a very important role in mobilizing not just that side of the spectrum, but also Islamists and vice versa. Their narratives are exactly the same, give or take. The incompatibility of Islam with the West, the incompatibility of these communities with each other, and so very nicely mutually reinforcing. Cumulative mainstreaming extremism. A little bit about the internet. The internet has played a role. We have been watching extremist groups migrate online and use a whole spectrum of tools so effectively. And those technologies are fast evolving. We're still talking here about how to respond with narratives and counter messaging and so on, social media. We're talking about the co-option of whole spaces. We're talking about botnets. We're talking about really sophisticated tools that have been developed, hacking groups that are already way ahead of this space. And we need to get ahead of that. And I'll come back to the getting ahead of the curve piece, because it's become much more sophisticated, and we are still a little bit 2007 on this. A little bit about learning from the best. So a couple of words about ISIS. I think the ISIS in many ways has been the standard bearer of the use of technology and social media for recruitment and radicalization. They have done a much, much better job than other Islamist groups, although there has been a huge propaganda machine in place, of course, in that space that predates and will outlive ISIS. There is no question about that. But what I find interesting, we talk a lot about the tools that they've used, and they have deployed tools, but what I think has marked them out for success is the strategy. And we often, I think, fail to talk about our own strategies. And this is something we need to learn from. A 55-page document that outlines the Islamic State's guide to media jihad, which was translated and analyzed in partnership with, friends of ours at King's College London, gave a really interesting insight into how they operationalize, how they do this. And there is three prongs to their approach. This is a strategy. Number one, make sure that the positive narrative comes first. Show the good life. Make that very clear, and make that good life clear in very localized, nuanced ways to different types of audiences. But the first piece of it is the positive narrative. The second piece is counter-messaging. Counter-messaging vis-a-vis Western propaganda. And the third is the weaponization of media. They understand very well that strategic communications, that psyops, that a whole range of tools can be used as media projectiles. But in addition to which, they know that they can weaponize the West's reporting of them And they know very well how to manipulate that. And I think we've probably fallen into that trap very nicely. But there is a strategy there. And when we ask the question, how do we measure and then how do we scale, we haven't even set that strategic framework yet. What is the objective that we seek to accomplish market by market? What is the change that we seek to effect? How do we then organize all the actors around this complex challenge and measure that? Because just reducing violent extremism isn't an objective. You can't measure that. We need to be much more strategic and then much more professionalized in our setting of objectives. So there's a lot we can learn there, both in terms of strategy and tools. In 2 years, they were able to achieve real global domination with their strategy through a remarkable media brand operation. How is it, as we sit here, that we aren't able? Positive narrative first, counter-messaging, weaponization. Russia. We have done some very interesting research into the German social media space and the political space in the lead up to the recent elections that saw the AfD, the extreme right party, come into power for the first time in the post-war period in Germany. Really significant and frightening, 13% of the vote. Now, far-right parties have taken much more of a slice of the vote in other countries, but this is Germany. And this is a country that's been educated on denazification, and yet here. And this is a result of what we've seen now as an extremely effective far-right strategy, supported by Kremlin, pro-Kremlin accounts. There's 10 bots that have been the main propagators of far-right content, pro-Russian content there that are interchangeable. Very interesting. And so what we're starting to see is, and I think we will be seeing much more of, is a bleed between state and non-state actors in this space, between technological tools that have been available in many ways, sophisticated tools that can be paid for by state actors. And this bleed between the various types of problem, fake news, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, extremism, that's the space that we're really dealing with now. If we don't connect the dots quickly in that space, we won't be responding to what the problem already looks like. And if we don't quickly get ahead of the curve on the technologies that are being used, and do more, as in innovate to get ahead of them, we will be completely outdone. I should say there is a gap already. I mean, we have analyzed this. I mean, the gap that we've allowed to emerge between the operations, the communications operations of extremist groups and the efforts of those that would seek to prevent them from spreading their ideologies is enormous. It's enormous in terms of content, strategy, technological tools and resources, and then simply the connecting up of the dots. What I found so interesting about looking now at the recent period in the far-right space is that organizations and movements as ideologically diverse as sort of very militant free speech groups have allied around certain grievances with a whole spectrum through to neo-Nazi groups. And the more extreme groups are using the more moderate groups in order to provide them with a platform to reach mainstream audiences. We need to be looking at those tactics and understanding them and responding, again, much more professionally than we have. So I think a couple of things just in terms of some of the pieces that I think we haven't addressed and looked at that we need to be thinking a little bit about. I do believe that the fundamental risk and problem, the fundamental threat we're facing is in fact not terrorism, although that is a byproduct of some of this. The real threat that we're facing is social polarization in a massive sense. The sort of social polarization that can lead us to conflict and, dare I say, genocide. Little steps often to normalize the path in that direction. It has happened before. It will happen again. And the idea that we're completely impervious to that in Western democratic environments is ludicrous. And we are seeing across the whole of Europe a real set of challenges to our democratic systems, dare I say here. Cumulative polarization and mainstream extremism. That is what we need to be looking at. We have also seen migratory flows that are larger than anything we've seen to date and are set to grow. And the refugee challenge on its own, which represents one of the greatest humanitarian catastrophes of our time, and that we are ineffectively dealing with, well, be that on our heads, because this is a constituency that is deeply vulnerable. And make no mistake, extremist groups are seeking to recruit from within those vulnerable constituencies because they know the political payoff of that form of recruitment and how much of a projectile that would mean in terms of the West's dealings with these issues. In terms of creating otherness, this is a perfect opportunity. But we have seen no prevention activities really systematically at all happen within these communities. There is no real systematic support to the prevention of recruitment and radicalization within refugee communities. And I think we desperately need to get ahead of that curve because that will dwarf anything that we see today. And so those investments need to happen upfront. And just a last note on gender, because I found that so interesting, what you said about the emasculation issues around identity in men, which I think go both ways. So we've done a lot of work on the radicalization of women. And I want to, there is a whole other thesis to be had on this. I think that you're absolutely right. There is a fundamental set of identity challenges here that are underpinning these processes of radicalization and recruitment. And one aspect of those identity challenges is a gender-related one. The place of men in a modernizing world, young men, boys, very big set of challenges that poses, and especially around the world in different cultural contexts, but equally for young women. And I'm always surprised by how surprised people are at the numbers of women that were recruited into ISIS. Staggering numbers. Because ISIS represented an empowerment for them. And so there are all these counterintuitive things that happen here, but we should be looking at gender. And ultimately, we need to be looking at women, because in terms of returnees from Syria and Iraq, there is a hugely disproportionate number of women that are coming back. And the big thing that none of us have really addressed yet is children. Because they are coming back with children. And they are coming back with children who have been to ISIS schools and who've cut their teeth there on that. And that is a set of challenges that we haven't even started to think through how we really address. Those are some of the things we need to quickly get ahead of the curve on. So I just want to say thank you very much for this opportunity. Sorry to bore you yet again, round two. But I do believe that this kind of community of activists and policymakers and private sector players and NGOs is vital to getting this right, and I hope we can start to build a better narrative around this than we have to date so that we can be more successful. Thank you very much for your time.